Before we start this evening's proceedings, the club would like to thank David, our landlord, for his friendship to the club. As a token of our we've also made David an honorary member of the club, which I think is
Well, I think the least we could do is have a little sing-song before we go. For he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, and so say all of us, and so say all of us, and so say all of us, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow.
It's the first time I've put a tie on since the company stopped paying for my dry cleaning, so thank you very much for that. It's been a pleasure, guys. Thank you for the last 20 years. Thank you for keeping me in a living. And yeah, I hope you find another Wheatsheaf to have your meetings in. Thank you.
There will be no other. We will fight again. So, thank you anyway.
Thank you very much.
Well done. Congratulations.
Free beers!
Just a couple of announcements.
So be it done it very shortly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well done.
It's actually the rules.
Forthcoming announcements. 26th of April we have the annual punting, picnic and plunge. 27th of April, World Hat Walk. Candlelight Club on the 10th of May.
Last one till the autumn.
Chat Magazine Grand Flaneur Walk, 11th of May, and Sheridan Weekends at the beach on the 16th to the 18th of May. Next monthly meeting is still to be confirmed. The Glorious Committee has tirelessly and selflessly been walking around the pubs of London looking for a new venue, so we'll announce that in due course. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Eugenie, who will talk on From Hero to Zero, the dramatic life of Oscar Wilde. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and I want to single out a member of the audience who is wearing a green carnation, which is what Oscar Wilde wore when it was the first night of Lady Windermere's fan. So, Oscar Wilde was born... Oh, sorry.
I reckon you could stand about there so
Yes. He was born on the 16th of October 1854. His father was a distinguished eye and ear surgeon, Sir William Wilde. His mother was a larger-than-life poetess who called herself Speranza. Sir William Wilde, Oscar Wilde's father, was brilliant and a polymath. He was a doctor, he was an archaeologist, and he was a very humane man. In the days before the NHS, he treated his poor patients for free, and he was the first doctor to perform a successful cataract operation. In a way that was to anticipate his son's life 21 years later, 1864 was the year of Sir William Wilde's greatest triumph and greatest failure. Triumph because he was knighted that year, failure because, again in a way that looks forward to what happened to his son, he found himself involved in a libel court case involving claims of sexual misconduct. His reputation was dented by this, not to the extent that Oscar Wilde's reputation was ruined, but it definitely cast a long shadow on his life. His first son was called William, after his father obviously, and like his brother Oscar, like his father, had a brilliant intellect, but he was profligate with it and was too keen on the bottle and the life of wild bohemia really to fulfill his promise. I see a certain sympathy from his members. I won't go into that too much. So Oscar had a sister 4 years after he was born called Isola. She died when Oscar Wilde was 10, and he felt her death very keenly. Oscar was initially tutored at home, and he had governesses who spoke French and German. They were French and German governesses, which gave Oscar a proficiency in these languages, and proficiency in French was going to stand him in excellence later on in his life. Then he went to a Protestant public school in Dublin, and thence he went to Trinity College, Dublin, as a classic scholar. He excelled, he got the gold medal for his Greek, and then he went to Magdalen College, Oxford, where he got a double first. Now, I've been so prating away, I've forgotten to show you. This is his father, this is his mother, and this is Oscar Wilde before he discovered the posts of Bunthorne, the Arch, Eastleigh. So you see he looks a little bit more in alignment with mainstream undergraduates in the 1870s. But we'll see his transformation here in a minute. So Oscar had considered becoming a Don, but the pettifogging regulations of Oxford University were not to his liking. Oscar Wilde saw himself as an antinomian. I've just learned this word, but basically it means somebody for whom the ordinary rules do not apply. He then considered being an inspector of schools, but that came to nothing. So he left Oxford, having won a prize for poetry, having academic glory, and a small private income. Like many Victorians, he was a snob, and he wanted to climb the ladder to the highest echelons of society. He was good at courting people with position and influence, and he shared digs with some sort of men about town who were quite prestigious socially. He became friendly with another ambitious outsider, the ravishing Lily Langtry, and it was a friendship of mutual benefit with a certain amount of self-interest. Oscar Wilde declared that had he not been in love with Lily Langtry, he would have fallen in love with the striking Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress. And he also said, a rather peculiar juxtaposition, he could have been happily married to any three of these women. Lily Langtry, Sarah Bernhardt, and, ladies and gentlemen, any guess who the third woman might have been?
Victoria.
Did you know that? That's right. It's sort of a bit of a joker in that path, but yes. Oscar Wilde had been in love with a woman of great physical loveliness called Florence Balcombe, who deserted him for somebody who was to write Dracula. We don't have Oscar Wilde's letters to her when they were courting, which was for 2 years. They obviously must have been destroyed. But we do have his final letters to her when he discovered she was engaged to another man, and his feeling very sorry for himself and jilted, and is asking for the trinkets he gave her, including a cross with the name Oscar on it, which she worn around her neck back. Now, Oscar was the most generous of men, so why he wanted the trinkets back was purely for sentimental reasons. Oscar started to make a name for himself through notoriety, and he became associated with the aesthetic movement, which was in full throttle at the end of the 1870s. Punch had cartoons by Du Maurier showing Mordell the painter and Jellyby Postlewhite the poet. These characters had been based on the poet Swinburne, but Oscar started to imitate them, and then it became a sort of self-referring loop. People thought, Du Maurier was inspired by Mr. Wilde, and then when Du Maurier saw that, he started to make his characters more like Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde published a book of poems. The poems were not up to much. Punch said quite rightly, aesthete's what's in a name. The poet is wild, but the poetry is tame. However, because Oscar Wilde was in the equivalent of Low magazine all the time, it went through 4 editions. But his big breakthrough came at the end of 81. Gilbert and Sullivan had written the operetta parodying the cult of the aesthete, Patience, with Bunthorne, who is a bit of a bogus aesthete poet. And it was very successful in London, but if we say now, when America sneezes, England catches a cold, something like that, it's the other way around in the 19th century. Sort of the fashion and the refinement came from London and had to be transported to America. So Gilbert and Sullivan thought, well, it would be no good if we take this operetta to America and they don't get the joke. So we need somebody to be an ambassador for the aesthetic fop. And of course, somebody puts very clearly in their mind, and they said to Oscar Wilde, would you go and give lectures and help us create a knowledgeable audience for when we bring the operetta across the Atlantic Ocean? So Oscar Wilde, who, like David Bowie, was a past master at images and was very keen on masks, he used to say, give a man a mask and he'll show you his true self. So he got rigged up in this outfit, and on the 24th of December 81, bundled in a fur coat that he loved dearly. He never forgave his brother for losing it or pawning it, we don't know which. He made the journey, and he was a success. He spoke very seriously about beauty and art, and he also is well known for his remark when faced with the customs official. I think a lot of you are chuckling in anticipation, but it's too good not to be repeated even to those who know it. The customs official said to Mr. Wilde, have you anything to declare, sir? And Wilde said, only my genius. But his genius wasn't yet in evidence. In some ways, he was a late developer. So he made a great success of his tour, and he also made quite a lot of money. He came back to England at the end of 82 and then went to Paris. He now entered his second incarnation. He was now a disciple of the great novelist Balzac. So gone was this kind of attire, he had a different hairstyle, and he would stroll along the streets with a cane, an ivory cane, with a turquoise handle, because that's what Balzac used to do. Oscar Wilde was a writer who was not very keen on the physical act of writing. He liked gossip and drink. But because Balzac was a workaholic, Oscar, when he was just sort of lolling around in cafes, used to say, I should be putting black on white. What he meant by that was pen to paper. His wit was not really appreciated in France. They didn't understand it. In England, persiflage and self-deprecation and telling the tall story in a mocking way when you're expecting your audience to know that you're exaggerating grossly fell on uncomprehending ears in France. They took everything very literally. However, he did make a friend called Pierre-Louis, who was to help him later when he wrote Salome. He wrote it in French, but although his French was excellent, he needed Pierre-Louis to make sure the grammar was tip-top. And Pierre-Louis was always very loyal to Oscar Wilde. You'll find me using the word not quite often when you speak of Oscar Wilde because of the zero phase of his life. It's all very well having friends when you're a hero, but who are your true friends when you're zero? So when Oscar Wilde was in Paris, he had two artistic blows. One was the play he'd written for the American actress Mary Anderson, was rejected by her. It's called The Duchess of Pageant, and it really isn't very good. And he'd also had a play produced by the American impresario and actress Marie Prescott called Vera or the Nihilists. It only lasted a week. And she suggested to Oscar a way of saving it. She said, come to America and act opposite me. But Oscar felt he would be a laughing stock if he did that. And I think he was right to make the decision not to go down that route. So he returned to London and he had to make a living because his income was fairly small, his private income. And because he loved the good life, he'd gone through his American earnings. So he did something which he felt was beneath him. He was a journalist. He said journalists really rely on fiction in their writing. And he also said he regarded journalism as the Darwinian survival of the most vulgar. Do you think with this attitude he was popular with his fellow journalists? No. However, he did make two long-lasting friends who were also journalists. One was George Bernard Shaw and the other was Frank Harris. Another thing that Oscar Wilde did that was not well received was he liked to be called Oscar by his friends or Mr. Wilde by his acquaintances. And in Fleet Street in those days, you used to call your fellow journalists by their surnames. But he said, no, you're not to call me Wilde. That's too familiar. So no, he wasn't very popular. In 83, he fell in love. This is Lily Langtry and Sarah Bernhardt posing together. So this is Constance Wilde with their son Cyril. So in 83, he fell in love with a beautiful Anglo-Irish woman, Constance Lloyd. Her father, who was dead, had been a barrister. Her grandfather was a fellow of Brasenose College. She absolutely worshipped the ground on which he stood. There's a letter which, with hindsight, is very poignant when she says, when they're engaged, I'm deliriously happy, I'm wild with happiness. They went to Paris for their honeymoon. And Oscar Wilde's friend, Robert Sherrick, visited them and said their room in their hotel was filled with laughter and flowers and youth, and they both seemed immensely happy together. In 85, Cyril was born, and in 86, their second son, Vivian, was born. But of course, when we talk about Oscar Wilde, people always think about his sexuality. Martin Fido, and I'm with Martin Fido on this, thinks that Oscar Wilde, until 1886, wasn't aware of his homosexual predilections. He was probably in a state of immature sexual confusion. And Frank Harris's Confessions of Oscar Wilde has Oscar Wilde explain his change of orientation because of Constance getting pregnant, and Oscar Wilde found her swollen body unattractive, and when she was expecting her second son, she was sick and vomiting a lot. And Wilde just found this repellent and said to Frank Harris, "The best love is sterile." So, although Constance was still in love with her husband, he told her he had, when he'd been an undergraduate, he'd contracted syphilis, and he said he now had syphilis sort of rearing its head again because it had been dormant, so he couldn't sleep with her. But more than that, he started to lead a life away from her. In 86, he met a young man called Robert Ross, who'd been born in Canada but came to England sort of when he was 2. And it's generally thought that Robert Ross was the first man to seduce Oscar Wilde, but this we cannot be sure of, it's just sort of conjecture. From 87 to 89, Oscar Wilde was the editor of Woman's World, and he proved to be a surprisingly conscientious and talented editor. By this time, he was a chain smoker, and for any new Sheridanites who love tobacco, you'll be happy to hear that Oscar Wilde said smoking is the most perfect of perfect pleasures. It is exquisite, and it leaves you unsatisfied. What more could one ask for? But in Fleet Street in the 80s, believe it or not, you weren't allowed to smoke in your office, and Oscar Wilde didn't like that. Anyway, by 89, he resigned his editorship because he felt confident that he could support his family by his writing. He'd already published some fairy tales, and the years 88 to 95 are his golden years of writing. He wrote short stories, he wrote fairy tales, and he wrote essays and literary criticisms. And in 1890, he wrote in serial form, as was the custom for most novelists in those days, his novel Dorian Gray, which he then published the following year as a complete novel. And he reworked it a little bit. How many people have read Dorian Gray in this book? Good, an educated audience. Or liars. Well, can I say that Oscar Wilde regarded lying as a supremely creative act, so he would approve. Yes. He also said insincerity is a way of expanding one's personality. So Dorian Gray read, can I put it, rose a few eyebrows, it doesn't look quite right, but a few eyebrows were lifted because people started to associate rumours that started to circulate about Wilde with this character. Dorian Gray himself is only explicitly mentioned as having had heterosexual liaisons. But people who didn't like Wilde started to say, like the author, like the hero, sort of thing. And there were cries from the Philistines, this is an immoral book. But Wilde said, no, it's very, very moral, because the man who lives, regardless of moral consequence, eventually is severely punished, and it eventually shows that you cannot lead a life of depravity without consequences. Oscar Wilde was also, like his hero Dorian, leading a double life by this time. On the one hand, he was a rising star in literary London. The nobility were inviting him to their tables, and Oscar adored this. He was dedicating poems and stories to Lord this and Lady that, and money was rolling in, but he was also, as he put it, feasting with the panthers. This was his euphemism for consorting with cheeky, illiterate male prostitutes who would do anything for a few quid. And he loved that. So, just as Dorian, on the one hand, is murdering, blackmailing, and then in sort of cheek by jowl, he's at the most fashionable clubs and soirees. There was Oscar Wilde feasting with his panthers and then being at house parties, very respectable and urbane. Oscar Wilde said that the world thinks I'm Lord Henry Wotton. That was the cynic and the sort of bon vivant who is rather amoral. He said, Basil Hallward, the artist who paints Dorian, is who I think I am. And Dorian is whom I would like to be in another age. When he wrote Dorian Gray, he had not yet met somebody who was to be his ruin, Lord Alfred Douglas. But Dorian Gray anticipates Lord Alfred Douglas. Dorian Gray is beautiful, innocent looking, with golden hair, blue eyes, and is described as being Narcissus-like. Later we get letters written to Lord Alfred Douglas Bosie, as he was known, describing Bosie as a Narcissus, and so white and gold I worshipped him, etc., etc. And like Dorian, Bosie Douglas, although he was charming and good-looking and very amusing and highly intelligent, was a bad lot. He was extremely selfish and self-absorbed. And as Max Bibbon, a friend of Oscar Wilde's, was to say, said, I didn't dislike Bosie. Sorry. This is Robert Ross, possibly Oscar Wilde's first male paramour. Here's Bosie. Max Bibbon said he didn't dislike Bosie, but he was obviously quite mad. He said, like all his family, I believe. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that one of Lord Alfred Douglas Bosie's ancestors had murdered a man and roasted him on a spit. Now, this sounds very medieval, but it occurred as recently as 1707. Anyway, anybody with a name like Bosie is a bit of a warning, I would suggest. Oscar Wilde, in his long letter to Bosie, some years later, says, one either had to give in to you or give you up. If only Oscar Wilde had known me, I would have advised him to give up Lord Alfred Douglas. They met through a poet called Lionel Johnson, who'd been to Winchester with Lord Alfred Douglas and was also studying in Magdalen with Lord Alfred Douglas. Oscar met him in 91, but didn't fall in love with him until 92. Bosie, who had had many sort of flings with young men at school, continued this habit in Oxford, and being careless and indiscreet was soon in hot water. He didn't know what to do or to whom to turn, and thought of Wilde. So he wrote a very charming letter begging Wilde to help him. Wilde got the worldly wise and efficient Sir George Lewis to deal with the scandal, and it was all covered over, but the consequences were disastrous for Oscar Wilde because he fell madly in love with this young man. If we're going to be salacious, and why not, let me tell you a little bit about their relationship. I won't be too graphic, so your blushes will be spared. It's actually, I'd say more than believed. The fact was their physical relationship was very short. It was 6 months maximum. The reason being, Oscar was 16 years older than Bosie. He was getting quite portly at this time, and his teeth were bad, so Bosie didn't really find him that attractive, even though Bosie, in his own way, did love Oscar. Really what they liked doing was chasing young boys together. So it was ultimately, ironically, rather a platonic relationship between the two of them, but a very strong emotional attachment. And in the letter that Oscar Wilde wrote him some years later, I think this soul connection is shown because Wilde writes to Bosie, your father could have had your body as long as I had your soul. Bosie's father was the Marquis of Queensberry, an eccentric, an atheist, and a quarrel picker. Queensberry had seen them together at the Café Royal in '92, and Bosie invited his father over to join them, and Wilde, with his charm and diplomacy, won over the Marquis of Queensberry, who wrote to his son, he's a marvellous fellow, but 2 years later they met again in the Café Royal, and this time Bosie was camping it up like anything, so was Oscar. And this was a red rag to a sort of heterosexual bull, which was the Marquis of Queensberry. And he wrote his son a letter saying, your behaviour was revolting, and don't you dare associate with the depraved Oscar Wilde. And Bosie couldn't stand his father, just loved having any means to provoke him, and wrote a telegram languidly saying, what a funny little man you are. Oscar Wilde became the cat's paw in this quarrel, and it escalated. While Oscar Wilde is treading on more and more eggshells, he's having phenomenal successes with his comedies. Initially, it's Lady Windermere's Fan. Then there's A Woman of No Importance. Then there's An Ideal Husband. The Prince of Wales attended the first night of An Ideal Husband. And then on Valentine's Day, 95, The Importance of Being Earnest. Alan Ainsworth, who played Algernon Moncrief in it, said he'd never seen anything like it. The audience was so enthralled. But Queensberry and his son are really keen to destroy each other. And Queensberry thinks that Wilde is his modus operandi. So he wants to throw a bouquet of rotting vegetables on the stage. The police are tipped off, and they prevent the Marquis from entering the theatre. So what does he do? He goes to the Albemarle Club, one of Oscar Wilde's clubs, and writes a card to Oscar Wilde posing as sodomite, gives it to the porter, who discreetly puts an envelope, And about a fortnight later, Oscar Wilde goes to the club. The porter said, "Sir, this card was left for you." Wilde sees it and loses his hand. And Bosie's rubbing his hands in glee, because all he wants to do is have his father in the dock and tell the whole world what a rotten father Marcus Queensberry is. So he says, you must sue for libel, even though we know this actually was not libelous. And some of Oscar Wilde's friends urged caution and say to him, the Victorian public will sympathise with a father trying to protect his son, but Bosie will have none of this. And Wilde is so under Bosie's thumb that he lets Bosie sort of just lead him down the precipice. Oscar Wilde would have done well to have asked Sir George Lewis to take the case for him, because Sir George Lewis is highly experienced and very sophisticated. But Oscar Wilde instead chooses Charles Humphreys, who knows very little about the homosexual underbelly of Victorian England. And he takes as counsel for Wilde Sir Edward Clarke, who also knows nothing of this Wilde. Sir Edward Clarke, who's an extremely upright barrister and will only represent people if he feels they are innocent if he's defending them, says to Wilde, is there any truth in these allegations? And Wilde, lying in his teeth, says, really, none whatsoever. So the case opens. The Marquis of Queensberry is in the dock for criminal libel against Oscar. It very quickly becomes clear that it's not the Marquis of Queensberry who's lying, it's someone else. So after 2 days, the case is dropped. Oscar Wilde's friends urge him to go to France, to escape, because it's clear that Queensberry's been doing his homework. He's had a lead to the brothel of Alfred Taylor, and the Panthers, inverted commas, is going to come in court and tell their tale. Alfred Taylor is an interesting character. He was an ex-public school boy, he'd been in the army, he managed to run through a vast fortune very quickly, and then had this house of assignation for transvestites and homosexuals, and Wilde and Bosie used to go there often. So Wilde's friends urge him, go when you can. But Oscar Wilde sits in the Cadogan Hotel drinking Hockenseltzer with Percy Douglas, Lord Alfred Douglas, Percy's brother, Robbie Ross. And when the last boat train to France has left, the police, having given the bird the opportunity to fly away, come into the hotel and they arrest him. Oscar spends a month in Holloway, and then the trial begins. That Oscar Wilde managed to have the jury undecided as to whether he was guilty or not, I think is a testimony to his brilliance. So there's going to be another trial because the jury couldn't decide. Let me also tell you something that I find deeply moving. Alfred Taylor had been promised indemnity if he would testify against Oscar Wilde. But although Alfred Taylor knew the consequences of being loyal to his client, his honour was more important to him. And he said, I will not and shall not testify against one of my clients. So Taylor was in the dock with Oscar Wilde as well. By this time, Oscar Wilde is a figure of opprobrium in London. He cannot stay at any hotels, and his friends, the Levisons, hide him in their children's nursery. But again, he has the opportunity to escape, and there are people who stand bail for him. But Oscar stays. We don't know why. Some people say it's because his mother, Speranza, said, even if you're convicted, you're still my son, but if you run away, that's an act of cowardice, and I shall disown you. My own feeling is there was something in Oscar Wilde's soul that wanted to see this through to the end. His soul wanted experience, no matter how awful it was going to be. There's a second trial, and Oscar Wilde is convicted of acts of gross indecency as sustainer, and he's sent to prison. This is Reading. He initially went to firstly Pentonville, then Wandsworth, and then Reading. And I'm going to show you his cell in Reading, the door, which was full of. The conditions were atrocious, and Wilde thought he was guilty. He appealed for early release, but very few of the great men of letters would back his appeal. Bernard Shaw was happy to, but said, I think my signature will do more harm than good, because as a socialist I was seen as being beyond the pale. Some friends would send him books. His wife visited him, and she still loved him. In Dorian Gray, Wilde says, when we fall in love, we begin by deceiving ourselves, and we end up by deceiving others. And what is rather pathetic, Constance, who had no idea what had been going on, we have letters when Wilde was with his Panthers and Bosie and what have you, and she's saying, Oscar Wilde's mad about golf. We know what sort of golf it was, but she didn't. She visits him, and she comes again. She makes the journey all the way from Genoa to tell him of his mother's death, because she wants to break the news gently. She has had to leave that beautiful house in Tite Street. Wilde has been bankrupted, and her children have to live abroad under a different surname. Constance tells the boys separately about their fathers being a prisoner. Cyril, the elder, found out. Vivian had no clue. He said, I thought my father might be a burglar or a bigamist. They adopt the name of Holland so that they can't be identified with Oscar Wilde, and they have to be sent to separate schools because the name Vivian and Cyril is so unusual that if they're together, it would be a big clue as to their identity. The last few months of Wilde's imprisonment are easier because Reading Jail has a new governor. He's called Major Nelson, and he's a humane man. And although he's working with a very harsh and draconian system, he's able to do what he can to make it palatable and bearable for the inmates as possible. The final 2 months, Oscar Wilde has a warder with a heart of gold, who gives him biscuits and newspapers, sub rosa. And something that touched Oscar Wilde deeply was when he had to leave prison briefly to appear in court for bankruptcy procedures, and the crowd is jeering as he makes the short journey from prison van to court, Robert Ross, his loyal friend, stands at the front of the queue, takes off his hat in a gesture of respect. Oscar Wilde is able to leave prison in May 1897, and And he goes to the home of one of the men who's tried to stand out for him. And there some of his loyal friends meet him. Oscar Wilde wanted to go on a retreat for 6 months with the Jesuits in Farm Street, but they turned down his request. So Oscar decides he must go to France because it's clear to him he cannot live in England, although he'd hoped he could. Robert Ross comes with him to France, settles him in a village in northern France near Dieppe. And there Oscar Wilde writes his last masterpiece, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. Oscar said, I wrote when I had not lived life. Now I've lived life, I cannot write anymore. But the reality was his spirit was broken. He loved his children dearly, and Constance, under the influence of her severe and moralising family, said he had to prove his penalty, and if he were pure as undriven snow at the end of the year, she and her boys would resume their life. But Oscar was too lonely and too broken to have the strength of character to hold out. And there was the siren call of Bosie saying, I miss you, look after you. So in October in Rouen, Oscar bursts into tears at seeing Bosie, and they hold hands, and then they go to Naples, and they're there for 3 months. Only 3 months, and then Oscar Wilde writes to Robert Ross, when the cash ran out, Bosie, who sponges of me always, abandoned me. He's actually being a little bit unfair on Lord Alfred Douglas. The truth of the matter was the women held the purse strings. Constance Wilde gave Oscar Wilde an allowance, a fairly meagre one, but an allowance. But one of the provisos was he must never associate with Lord Alfred Douglas. So when he did, stopped. Lady Queensberry, Bosie's mother, gave Bosie an allowance. And again, that was on condition that he didn't associate with Wilde. So the two women stopped, the money flowing, so the two men had to part. And Wilde, knowing which side his bread was buttered on, sort of curries favour with Robbie Ross by saying, oh, you know, Bosie's treating me badly, only you're the one who's loyal and devoted, etc. And Robert Ross is very happy to hear that, because there's always this sort of rivalry between Bosie and Robert Ross. Oscar calls himself Sebastian Melmoth, a sort of suitably audacious nickname, and he travels to Switzerland, he travels to Sicily, he goes to Rome, he returns to France. But the spirit has gone out of him, and it's a life of chasing boys, drinking, eating and idling, but with no real spiritual substance. And yet Wilde is a very spiritual man. Constance Wilde dies in 1898. Modern medicine says it was probably multiple sclerosis, which wasn't well understood in Victorian times. But Vivian Holland, in his book, Son of Oscar Wilde, says the underlying cause was a broken heart, because Constance always loved Oscar. Oscar shed crocodile tears. He didn't really mind, I'm afraid to say. And both Frank Harris and Robert Ross said he really, it's all show when he says, oh, this is a tragedy. He's not really affected.